Good morning, everyone, and warmly welcome to the fourth Wittrock lecture held in honor of the contributions of Professor Björn Wittrock to SCAS and to the academic community more broadly. Today's lecture will be given by Professor Linda Colley. Warmly welcome, Linda. Linda Colley is Shelby M.C. Davis 1958 Professor of History at Princeton University and a current Fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Since 2018, she is also long-term Fellow in History here at SCAS and contributes significantly with her sharp intellect and wisdom to the shaping of SCAS' academic profile. A Fellow of the British Academy, she is also a former member of the board of the British Library, where in 2008 that is, she organized an exhibition of historical text to do with rights entitled Taking Liberties, opened by the then UK Prime Minister. She has also served on the research committees of the British Museum and the Tate Britain. She holds 7 honorary degrees, of which the last was awarded by the University of Oxford last year. She is the author of 7 books, including Britons, Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, which was a winner of the Wolfson History Prize. And her latest work, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions, and the Making of the Modern World, was awarded the 2021 Book of the Year Prize by the International Forum on the Future of Constitutionalism. She also writes regularly on history and politics for the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the Guardian and Financial Times newspapers. And just recently, Linda has been made a Dame of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in the Queen's birthday honors. And in the announcement, we may read, and I quote, Professor Linda Colley is recognized for an outstanding contribution to history. Awarded a CBE in 2009, she has continued to produce historical works of profound political and cultural relevance, helping the understanding of Britain's constitutional place in the world and of constitutions more generally, end quote. Great pleasure that I welcome you to give your lecture, Linda.
Thank you so much, Christina. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming through the rain to listen. My initial connection with SCAS was owing to 2 mighty and irresistible forces. One of these mighty and irresistible forces was naturally Björn, in whose honor these lectures operate. The second of these forces, however, was a volcano in Iceland. I came to Uppsala in 2010 to give lectures at the university, and the volcano erupted again. The air was full of ash, and I couldn't leave. And I saw the university authorities getting more and more worried. Was I going to be a drain on their resources forever after? But with his typical generosity and kindness, Björn stepped in and offered me the use of a vacant office here for my time in Uppsala. And I was immediately hooked. Indeed, I was deeply sad when the clouds dispersed and I was able to leave. But I did have a subsequent fellowship here, which was very productive, during which I was able to draft many of the chapters of my last book, which, as we've heard, appeared last year, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen. So I thought it was only appropriate that I draw on this book while developing out of it for this lecture. And that's what I'm going to do. The lecture is called Constitutions in Time of Crisis. In 2020, 2 years ago, Russia's constitution was altered in part so as to proclaim that country's commitment to, I quote, the peaceful coexistence of states and peoples, and to strengthening, I quote again, international peace and security. These amendments to the Russian constitution clearly touch on the relationship between constitutions on the one hand and order and crisis on the other. But they also raise obvious questions, these amendments, about how historians and everyone else can usefully approach, understand, and assess constitutional texts of this sort. Written or codified constitutions are not and never have been pure legal, domestic, and philosophical statements. Over the centuries, these documents have frequently been characterized by deliberate untruths, by undertakings that are subsequently broken, and by calculated, often revealing silences. Political constitutions have also, more often than not, proved short-lived texts, and they have frequently been bound up with violence. So, how can examining these texts and their contexts contribute to wider histories and to our understanding of the world? In this lecture, I want to propose some answers to these questions. I want to suggest why we need to take these instruments seriously and think about them. I also want to signal some topics and questions to do with them that seem to me to merit further research. Constitutions unavoidably demand our attention because for all their failings and limited shelf life, they have proved relentlessly contagious in world history. If we take a political constitution now generally, though not exclusively, note, to be a written document, an endurable, objective thing, in Hannah Arendt's words, then this sort of device was increasingly being resorted to, both in parts of Europe and in North America from the mid-18th century onwards. By the 1810s and 20s, the use of written constitutions was multiplying fast in Central and Southern America. During the second half of the 19th century, an era where franchise rights for men expands dramatically, regions of Asia, North Africa, and the Pacific world also experimented with texts that were widely treated as constitutions, though also contained many distinctive facets. The First World War, which destroyed old systems of states, along with 4 monarchical empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Tsarist Empire, the dual monarchy of Austro-Hungary, and the German Empire, provoked a flurry of further, often ephemeral constitutions. So even more did the Second World War. And this contagion of constitutions is still at work. Between 1990 and 2015 alone, there are estimated to have been over 100 new written political constitutions. Now, approaching this broad phenomenon comprehensively and historically can be inhibited by prevailing methodologies and teleologies. At one level, studies of past constitutions often adopt a purely national and sometimes highly patriotic focus, whereby one particular polity's paper texts and their origins and meanings are examined only in isolation. At another level, the marked decline since the 1950s in the fashionability and currency of constitutional history, a decline which is now being reversed, has led to the subject of constitutions becoming dominated by legal scholars and political scientists. The primary concern of these scholars is often to examine the evolution of just one particular aspect of the spread of written constitutions, namely the rise of democratic constitutionalism. Yet while the linkages between constitutions and different modes of democracy are clearly important, this is only part of the story. The spread of written constitutions has never been just about one thing. These instruments have been utilized, and they still are, by a wide spectrum of different governing regimes, by monarchies as well as republics, by autocracies and single-party regimes, as well as by would-be liberal states, by empires as well as self-proclaimed nations. Moreover, while we can certainly view these instruments as contributing to the rise of our modern world, there have been and are, of course, multiple modes and perceptions of modernity, not just the Western varieties. All this helps to explain some of the approaches I adopted in my recent book, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, which was partly designed to reimagine and reinvigorate constitutional history and to revive the subject among historians and others, to get people thinking. As those of you who have read the book know, it takes deliberately a transnational and transcontinental approach, and it treats codified constitutions as a spreading genre and as malleable and multi-purpose pieces of political technologies, not as devices that have invariably been possessed of a particular set of characteristics. I do, however, argue that while the circumstances surrounding the adoption of these devices over time and in different locations have obviously varied, there are certain patterns that have repeatedly occurred. In all continents, the initial adoption, especially of a new written constitution, has frequently been an outcrop of crises and ruptures of some sort, particularly crises and ruptures to do in some way with war and conflict. So why? Why war as a stimulus to constitution writing? And how war in this regard exactly? After all, virtually every society in the long human past appears to have been characterized by intermittent warfare and outbreaks of violence. How, when, and why, therefore, did passages of conflict and extreme violence begin to feed into the writing and proliferation of a certain type of political constitution? And what kinds of wars are we talking about here? Here are a few points to think about and consider. First, it was often not just a matter of warfare per se, but of major shifts in the technologies, nature, and strains of warfare. By the mid-18th century, the expense of running major hybrid wars, by which I mean in this context long-distance conflicts involving both large-scale armies and large-scale navies, had risen to critical levels. If you compare, for example, the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, overwhelmingly a land-based conflict, with the wars of the early and mid-18th century, the latter are much further aflung. They're connected with getting extra-European colonies. They involve, therefore, navies as well as armies for the big players. This enormously ups the cost. This put extreme pressure, especially, on the state finances of the two protagonists most involved in this new mode of hybrid warfare, Britain and France, in both cases with dramatic constitutional repercussions. The British attempt in the wake of the 7 Years' War to address the challenge of accelerating hybrid warfare and its costs by raising taxes on its American colonists ultimately led, of course, to the outbreak of another, this time revolutionary and ultimately global war. This latter conflict, the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783, resulted, among other things, in the emergence of a new, initially precarious United States, which sought to order, legitimize, and distinguish itself by drafting and publicizing a series of new constitutions. Britain's prime rival, France, also failed to resolve its hybrid, war-related financial woes, famously resulting in this case in a revolution on its own soil in 1789. This French revolutionary crisis in turn led rapidly both to a series of new French constitutions and to a succession of protracted wars in continental Europe and in French Saint-Domingue, the future Haiti. These protracted conflicts gave a spur to the writing of yet more constitutions, both in these two regions of the world, continental Europe and Haiti, and after 1809, in one-time Portuguese and Spanish colonies in Central and South America, because in 1809, Napoleon's forces move into the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese monarchy has to take refuge in Brazil. The Spanish monarchy has to go into exile. And this gives a spur to rising independence activism in Portuguese and Spanish colonies in Central and South America. In underlining the centrality of these and later episodes of armed conflict for the design and proliferation of political constitutions, I'm not, repeat not, seeking to downgrade the role of ideas, ideologies, idealism, and individuals. This is not at all the point I'm making. I'm suggesting rather that we need to see these things in tandem. Ideals, ideas, and warfare and crisis come together in the forging of so many new constitutions. In 1787, in a newspaper essay which later became part of the Federalist Papers, the politician, lawyer, and one-time soldier Alexander Hamilton suggested that revolutionary Americans had gained a unique chance to design a government, I quote, from reflection and choice, as distinct from being constricted by the flux of accident and force in the manner of other older polities. And this judgment of Hamilton is often cited. Oh, they could just meet the founding fathers in Philadelphia in 1787 and think great thoughts. But in so making this claim that Americans could construct government purely from reflection and choice, Hamilton was in fact setting up an exaggerated binary for propaganda and political purposes. The new American Constitution, drafted at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, was in reality very much a compromise between post-war imperatives and changing ideas. Its makers, the founding fathers, were desperate, they had no choice, to restore the new American Republic's finances in the wake of protracted warfare, to keep the different composite states together now that Britain, the unifying enemy, had been driven out, and to try to keep other rival and rapacious European empires out of US territory, as well as to keep a lid on democratic and slave activism at home. To this extent, this American Revolutionary Constitution was itself, Pache Hamilton, a product of force and of fears of yet more force. Simultaneously, though, and as the debates at Philadelphia illustrate, the contents and shape of the 1787 Constitution were informed by Enlightenment and Republican ideas and habits. In other words, by force and by reflection and choice, both. These things go together. Second point I want to make: although wars and violent ruptures have been a recurring feature, there were and remain different ways in which these things have fed into constitution making. New written constitutions have often, for instance, been products of military defeats. Innovations that have supplied vanquished polities with a means to reorganize and reinvent and re-legitimize themselves. This was the case with France, Japan, and Germany in the wake of the Second World War. Constitutions have often indeed been wholly or partly imposed on defeated countries by their foreign conquerors. This was the case post-1945 with the two latter countries, Japan and Germany, where the constitutions in each case were substantially written by allied politicians and lawyers. And this was also widely the case in regard to many of Napoleon's European conquests before 1815, as Napoleon surges through continental Europe, making a new empire for himself. In some of his conquests, he imposes a new constitution. He does this in many of the Italian lands and German lands and in what becomes Holland, in Spain indeed. In part, these are full of Enlightenment ideas, toleration for Jews, an end for feudal taxes, etc., etc. But they are again also dictated by force, not just his own conquests, but in these new Napoleonic constitutions, you see always the demand for more taxes, the demand for more men for his armies. Force as an instrument is still there. This pattern of constitutional innovation, following on from military defeat and or the fall or humiliation of a governing regime, still takes place. However the current Russian-Ukrainian horrors end, it is more than possible that the result will have constitutional repercussions of some sort. In the event of Russian military success, an assimilationist and restrictive constitution may well be imposed on a defeated Ukraine or on part of it, along with a tractable local ruler. Conversely, if Putin falls and fails alongside his special operation, then we may see a replacement Russian regime seeking to inaugurate, legitimate, and redeem itself by means of issuing a fresh constitutional text. As this suggests, codified constitutions have always been performative and propaganda instruments, as well as legal and political texts. And they have frequently been crafted with an international audience in mind, as well as the domestic population concerned. I've been talking about constitutions and those with power, but I should also say that war and crises can also lead to, and has led to, interest and commitments to constitutions from those below as well. And Max Weber talked about this, as polities are increasingly putting greater demands on their population in the way of conscription and tax to fight wars or to recover from them, you tend to get increasing agitation, of course, widely in the population, saying, we want a different kind of government. If we are going to put ourselves out then we want more say in how we are governed. And that happens again and again. So let me develop this larger theme, the uses of constitutions as perceived from below, not just from the point of those in charge. And let me again touch on a few points in this regard. First, there's a recurring pattern over the long 19th century of territories which view themselves as being under threat by colonizing and expansionist powers, seeking in response to strengthen and advertise their autonomy and make an international case for their survival by designing and publicizing a new political constitution. Again, this performative aspects of constitutions. You're not just interested in the domestic response, you're producing a text to get a wider reaction. Thus, the Polish-Lithuanian Constitution of 1791, which doesn't last long but is very interesting, was, among other things, a failed attempt to repel a final obliterating partition by the forces of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Here's another example of this same pattern of constitution making as a response to threatened imperial takeover. From 1840, the small Pacific islands of Hawaii generate a succession of fascinating constitutions. These widely circulated and printed and translated documents were designed to affirm, while also subtly modifying, Hawaii's distinctive cultures and political organization, and to impress foreign capitals, and thus Hawaiians hoped, to help deter potential American or European takeover, a ploy which partly succeeds until the 1890s, when the USA does indeed move in and take control of Hawaii. The seminal Meiji Constitution in Japan in 1889, and I'll return to this one, was in part another example of this sort of use of a new written constitution as a means of defensive modernization, to use Jürgen Osterhamel's phrase, in the face of potential foreign threats. Only this time, the strategy proved a wildly and widely influential success. Meiji Constitution, tremendously important. In some ways, it's a very conservative constitution, but it's the first Asian constitution that manages to endure. It lasts until the Second World War. And this becomes very important for those parts of the world seeking to resist Western hegemony. Here is proof, they think, that the non-Western world can not just generate written constitutions, but can generate constitutions that will last. And this is a very, very important development. Particularly threatened groupings within certain polities have also sometimes sought and sometimes succeeded in being able to profit from or helping to initiate or influence new constitutional orders. Thus, the duration and ferocity of the wars of independence in South America after 1809 along with the protracted struggles post-independence between this continent's various new nations, frequently led to concessions being made on paper to one-time slaves, local Indian groupings, and poor whites. So you get involved in a new war, and so what do? You create yet another new constitution saying these local Indian groupings can now have full political rights in return for fighting with us. That kind of deal. As I say, these kind of disadvantaged groupings are sometimes able to secure greater rights by way of new or amended constitutional texts in return for the offer of military service. Partly as a result of this, by 1850, many South and Central American republics were characterized both by record numbers of successive short-lived constitutions and by much wider levels of democracy for men than existed in the United States or in most of Europe. And this, of course, raises the issue, how do we judge the success of a constitution? Because it used to be argued, not least in the United States, where the Constitution has lasted for a long time, too long, arguably, that the fact that South America generated so many constitutions, which don't last very long, was a sign of that continent's extreme political instability. Clearly, they just couldn't get it together. Well, that's true up to a point, but it's also true that by 1850, there are many republics in South America which have given black males political rights, which have given indigenous people political rights. Not true in the United States. So there are different criteria of success we need to think about. Note, however, that this tendency in the Americas for non-white and poor white groupings occasionally to draw profit from constitutional changes as a result of pressures of war seem sometimes to have built on pre-independence precedents. Even before the fall of the Portuguese regime in Brazil in 1822, for instance, native groupings in its Amazonian region, we now know, were able to secure what passed for wider civic rights in return for contributing manpower to the embattled and economically broke Portuguese imperial order. Such grantings of wider political rights to indigenous males in return for military service sometimes functioned indeed as a tactic for colonial assimilation or would-be colonial assimilation. Amazonian Indians who accepted this pre-1822 Portuguese imperial deal were expected to begin living in fixed houses and to start wearing clothes and stop going naked. The complex links that have obtained in some regions in the past between indigenous groups and the enslaved on the one hand and constitutional innovation on the other, and the degree to which indigenous and slave activists and the very poor have sometimes been able to intervene in constitution making and discussion is currently one of the hottest research topics in regard to the Americas and South Asia. Some of the resulting new findings and research methods could usefully, I think, be applied elsewhere. The linkages between conflict and constitution making, which I've only been able to touch on selectively, prompt in turn further questions. Most constitutions drafted in the past have been overwhelmingly, though not always entirely, the work of elites and specialists of different kinds: politicians, rulers, military men, lawyers, senior bureaucrats, and the like. So what is it that allows elite-driven constitutional texts of this sort sometimes, subsequently, to become widely accepted as contracts, as emblems for an entire polity and its population? What makes a constitution stick? The challenges involved in achieving this, converting what is often an elite-driven text into a feature of a political system capable of attracting wide and sustained loyalty and acceptance, becomes even greater when a constitution needs to be put together very quickly, which, since constitutions are so often a product of crisis, is often the case. All constitution makers, but especially those working at speed, have been to a degree borrowers. Extreme example: the Norwegian Constitution of 1814, which endures still, was drafted in just 5 weeks because an invading Swedish army was known to be on the way. As a result, the Norwegian delegates involved borrowed furiously, calling in printed copies of whatever constitutions could be got hold of, and in some cases lifting entire paragraphs from the published constitutions of France, the USA, Holland, Spain, and elsewhere. But even when constitution makers can take more time over their task, the need to put in place a new political settlement fairly promptly, as well as other factors, normally leads to a degree of calculated plagiarism. Written constitutions are like patchwork quilts: a bit from here, bit from there, bit from somewhere else. Even something as famous as South Africa's first post-apartheid constitution of 1996, its makers still borrow, not least and out of conviction from the current German constitution, the Basic Law. The first and most widely known article of the latter text, the Basic Law, indeed, some Germans tell me the only part of it that's widely known, is the statement that human dignity shall be inviolable. And one can understand how this might have a powerful appeal in post-apartheid South Africa. Hence, you borrow this statement and incorporate it in this new post-apartheid South African constitution. Now, since codified constitutions are so often hybrids in this fashion, mixes of local and foreign ideas, again the question arises: how far and how can these hybrid creations be made to appear and successfully function as icons for allegiance? The need to address and explore issues of this sort underlines why a broadening out of constitutional history is so important. Exploring a constitution only in a national context is likely to miss out on the ways in which its making and content may very well have been influenced by writings, ideas, and actions from elsewhere. Precisely because these are written texts, successful and striking constitutions especially have regularly been able to be widely reprinted in multiple languages in multiple locations. This was manifestly true of the American and various French constitutions, constantly being reprinted in different languages. It was true too of the Spanish Cadiz Constitution of 1812, one of the great bestsellers in the 19th century in multiple languages. It was true of the Japanese Meiji Constitution of 1889, which went not just into European languages, but also into some Chinese, Ottoman, and Indian languages and print sources. More recently, the Indian Constitution, which came into effect in 1950, has been widely publicized in multiple languages. And this connection between constitutions and print culture is a huge trend which has never really properly been examined. And I think that it comes to be so huge helps to explain why the British in the 19th century start making a cult of their own cultural history and producing endless books and pamphlets on their real or reputed constitutional history. Why do the British do this? Well, of course, they haven't got a constitution that's written and can be printed and distributed around the world to influence people. They still don't have such a constitution, though that may change in the next couple of decades, I think. So what the British do is to think of this different strategy, to say, okay, we haven't got a constitution to get translated and distribute around the globe, so we will push our special constitutional history and use our print networks to send this round the globe, which is what they do. So, a more rapid expansion of print outlets, the exponential rise in some regions of the world of cheap and rapidly produced print, and an acceleration in literacy rates, clearly all played roles in the rise and spread across continents of written constitutions. That this was so underlines again why any new variant of constitutional history will need to be cast broadly. It will have to intermesh more with cultural history, with the history of language and with the history of the book and consumerism. It will also have to intermesh more as well with religious history, a connection which requires much more research. And I'm thinking of the excellent lecture we had yesterday, which again reminded me of this. Some scholars have suggested, for instance, that the markedly early take-up of codified constitutions in parts of North America and Northern Europe, Sweden, for instance, can be linked to these areas' predominantly Protestant allegiance. The Protestant belief that all individuals had a right to read the scriptures for themselves could segue easily, it has been argued, into an acceptance that the organization of politics and rights should also be made accessible in words and print for anyone to read and scrutinize. It's a very seductive idea, but I suspect it's a tad biased by the familiar Protestant notion that we are more liberal than Catholics. In fact, if you look, you can see Catholics, including Catholic priests, playing a big part in the spread of constitutions. They are major players in the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, and they play a regular, in part, Catholic priests in reading out the texts of political constitutions to those of their worshippers who cannot read. Something that's still going on in rural Ireland in the 1930s, for instance. And as we were reminded yesterday, black churches in the USA and also, of course, in South Africa play important roles in the struggle for black political rights and constitutional change. More complex and very contentious, and I don't have the time or the expertise to go into this, is how one copes with the story of written constitutions in those predominantly Muslim regions of the world where printing presses generally spread very slowly, in Central Asia, for instance. Printing presses and constitutions of the written sort are intimately connected. So what about regions of the world without print? How do we approach them? Should we, as some specialists contend, be looking out in Muslim and other non-Christian territories for rather different understandings and expressions to do with rising constitutionalism? This is a big debate at present. What I think is abundantly clear already, and this is my last substantive point, is that in multiple regions, a resort to local cultural forms has played a role in making a largely elite-driven constitution full of borrowings from elsewhere appear nonetheless a natural and indigenous growth. Visual imagery has sometimes played a part in this, as well as words, as well indeed as rituals. The current Indian constitution is a case in point. In line with the determination of its makers, conspicuously Ambedkar, that this was to be an educative and teaching text, each of the Indian constitution's 22 parts was planned in the late 1940s as coming complete with illustrations. The thinking behind these images, which drew on Indian folklore, religions, and myths, went far beyond decoration. The official intention was to celebrate with these drawings Indians' 5,000-year-old history, as the Constitution put it, of which this new Indian Constitution was to be viewed as an integral part, one more splendid episode in a long, distinctive, but now democratic history. Now, in fact, of course, large parts of this Indian constitution were taken from British documents, from Australian and US documents, and more. But the Indian constitution was to be made indigenous by a use of languages and also by this use of traditional emblems and illustrations. Here's an example of a constitution being deliberately planned and utilized as a piece of invented tradition, part of a story that India had continued for 5,000 years, and this was just one more step along the way. So, I've been trying to draw connections between constitutions and crises. So, what about the challenges now? Given that they are so often bound up with existential crises of some kind, how are new constitutions to emerge without perhaps that kind of stimulus? The United States seems to me to exhibit that problem at present, hence some of its political turmoil. The American Constitution, the federal Constitution goes back, was drafted in 1787 in a completely different world, which might not have harmed so much, but amendment was deliberately made very difficult in this constitution. And most of the gains in civil rights in the United States, note, have come from war. It's the Civil War of the 1860s, which gives black males, at least on paper, access to the vote and citizenship. It is the First World War which brings women into the US franchise on the whole. It is the Second World War which widely expands equality of access to education in the US. But with amendments so difficult, how do you keep revamping this constitution so that it works better? No answer has thus far emerged. And of course it's more challenging because the nature of warfare has changed. Governments don't have to go to their people anymore and say, we want to conscript you, so here are more rights. The technology has shifted. Those kind of manpower and woman power demands in general don't exist anymore. So, how do we keep these instruments going? How do we keep them relevant? After all, deference has largely subsided. You can't have founding fathers anymore dictating from above. You've got to involve more people in constitution making. How do you do that? Again, I think this is an issue that lots of states have been having to wrestle with. And then finally, there's the issue of technology. And this is my last point. Growing numbers of us in the world now inhabit societies where the population gets the bulk of its political information from a screen, not from the printed page. Moreover, the coming of a digital age is relentlessly bringing about a balkanization of data and debate in regard to politics and allegiance as much else. We are increasingly leaving behind a narrow aperture world where individuals relied heavily for their political orientation on just a few television and radio channels, a few major national newspapers and magazines, and perhaps their local church. Instead, in many locations, there is now a cacophony of potential political information, influences, and nostrums transmitted by way of multiple media and multiple voices. The implications of all this for the status, operation, and futures of would-be iconic written political constitutions require far more thought, analysis, and attention. Thank you very much.